Savannah Moore had never thought of herself as someone who would end up in a fight with an entire neighborhood, much less with an association that claimed authority over things it barely understood. When she bought the weathered stone house on the hill 8 years ago, it was more of a refuge than a home. The land was old, older than most of the houses surrounding it, and the well at the back of the property had been there long before any of the paved roads or the sterile lawns that now defined the community below. Her father used to say that the well was a piece of the mountain's heart, drilled by the original settlers before city water was even an idea. Savannah liked that. It made her feel connected to something that had existed before rules and permits and meetings where people argued about mailbox colors. She'd had the water tested more than once, perfectly clean every time, crisp and cold enough to sting her teeth. It was more than a utility to her. It was a quiet point of pride, proof that self-sufficiency could still exist in a world that demanded permission for everything. Her days followed a steady rhythm. Early mornings spent in the garden before the heat set in, afternoons working from her studio where she designed landscapes for clients who mostly wanted the illusion of nature without any of the inconvenience. She would glance out her window occasionally and see the neat rows of HOA-approved hedges along the neighboring streets, every blade of grass trimmed to regulation height. Her property didn't match their perfection, and she preferred it that way. The wildflowers by her fence grew high enough to hide the old pump system, and the ivy that climbed her porch rails was a small rebellion she refused to cut back. Sometimes she'd hear the hum of the HOA maintenance trucks down below, and it always reminded her how different her little piece of land was. A pocket of stubborn authenticity, surrounded by polished uniformity. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly, almost politely. One evening, while recording her monthly water readings in a leather-bound notebook she kept by habit, she noticed the numbers had dropped slightly. It wasn't much, just a few inches. But the well had always been stable, even during drought seasons. Savannah didn't think much of it at first. She told herself it might be the new irrigation line she'd added for her greenhouse, or perhaps just an early sign of summer dryness. Still, the unease lingered. She marked the level in red ink and added a small note. Monitor next week. The following days were warm, and the drop continued. When she filled a bucket one morning, she noticed the flow wasn't as strong as usual. The sound of the pump seemed thinner, more strained. There was a mechanical sadness to it that she couldn't explain, like something quietly begging for help. She crouched beside the well cap, listening, the faint echo of the water below carrying through the metal. It was still there, steady, but weaker. She felt a strange sense of intrusion, as if someone else had been taking from it without asking. The thought unsettled her, though she dismissed it quickly. No one else had access to her system. The well was sealed, the lines private. At night she sat on her porch, notebook in her lap, staring at the faint glow of the HOA street lamps below. The neighborhood looked peaceful from up here, all order and quiet symmetry. Yet beneath that calm surface, she sensed something pulling, like the water itself was being drawn away from her, silently, invisibly. She told herself she was overthinking it. But as she turned off the porch light and stepped inside, the hum of the pump echoed faintly from the backyard, running longer than it should have. It was the first time Savannah Moore felt that her independence, the simple life she had built around this land and its well, was not as untouchable as she had once believed. 2 weeks later, Savannah received an envelope that stood out from the usual cluster of mail balanced on her gatepost. The paper was thick and cream-colored, embossed with a logo she recognized instantly. The Homeowners Association seal, a tasteful circle of leaves surrounding the initials of a council she had never once voted for. She had always assumed her property stood outside their jurisdiction. Technically, it did. Her lot was carved from an older survey, part of the original township before the subdivision consumed the surrounding hills. But the letter in her hands suggested someone, somewhere, had decided otherwise. Inside, printed in the precise, unyielding tone that bureaucracies favored, was a Community Water Compliance Notice. The message was simple. All private wells and non-regulated water sources within the extended boundary of Lakewood Heights were to be decommissioned or connected to the municipal line within 60 days. The reason cited was concern over unmonitored extraction volumes and potential ecological impact. The words read like they'd been copied from a manual, but the meaning was clear. Her well was now forbidden. She read the notice 3 times, certain she had missed a line that exempted older properties or existing systems. There was nothing. The bottom of the page bore a list of signatures from the HOA board, none of which she recognized. One of them, a neat slanted signature belonging to the current president, was underlined twice, as if to emphasize authority. Savannah felt an old frustration stir in her chest, the same one she used to feel when her clients dismissed her design recommendations in favor of whatever looked more symmetrical. She placed the letter on the kitchen counter and stared at it as if it might explain itself. The phrasing was careful, yet the implications were invasive. Decommissioned, connected to municipal supply. Both options meant surrender. By evening, she walked down the sloped road to the neighborhood's common office, a converted model home with glass doors and a faint smell of disinfectant that never quite faded. Inside, a young woman at the reception desk greeted her with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be Ms. Moore," she said, as though Savannah had been expected. "We've just updated the zoning map last month. Your property now falls under Lakewood Heights jurisdiction. Congratulations on becoming part of our community." The words were smooth, almost rehearsed, and Savannah felt a chill run through her. "I didn't agree to that," she said evenly. "My property predates your development by 50 years. The woman's smile remained fixed. "There was a referendum," she replied, opening a binder that looked too pristine to have seen real use. "A community-wide vote in March. The residents approved expansion by majority." Savannah wanted to laugh at the absurdity. She had been in Colorado for a landscape conference the entire week of that so-called vote, and no one had notified her about any changes. "Did you send notices?" she asked. The woman nodded, tapping the folder. "Of course. Certified mail. We have a record of delivery." Savannah's stomach tightened. No such letter had ever reached her, and she doubted it had been lost by accident. "Then someone forged my consent," she said. The woman's expression didn't change, but her tone cooled slightly. "If you believe an error occurred, you can file an appeal. It's Form 9B, but I should warn you, appeals can take several months and fines begin after the compliance period expires." She handed Savannah a yellow pamphlet with cheerful clip art images of water meters and smiling families. The header read, "Working together for a sustainable tomorrow." The irony made Savannah's hands tremble. Walking back up the hill, the air felt heavier, as if the mountain itself disapproved. She glanced toward her garden where the pump quietly thudded beneath the soil. It seemed almost alive, an old heartbeat she now had to defend. That night she sat at her desk and began writing a letter of protest. The tone was firm but measured. She referenced property laws, historic exemptions, water rights. When she finished, she realized her hands were shaking. She wasn't angry yet, just unsettled by the realization that someone had casually redrawn the lines of ownership and expected her to accept it. 3 days later, another letter arrived. This one bore an even colder formality. Notice of preliminary violation. The HOA accused her of failing to comply with community water regulations and warned that penalties would accrue daily until her well was either sealed or connected to the approved system. At the bottom was a line that caught her attention. Failure to adhere may result in administrative action, including suspension of property privileges. The phrase was absurd. What privileges? She owned her land outright, but the wording had been chosen carefully, leaving just enough ambiguity to sound menacing. As she read the letter, a low vibration filled the house, the pump activating on its own. Savannah frowned, stepping out to the back porch. The air smelled faintly of damp metal. She listened to the rhythmic pulse of water moving through pipes and wondered how much of it was hers anymore. The timing of the pump's activity had become erratic, almost as if someone else were drawing from it. She followed the faint hum across the yard toward the old concrete housing that protected the main valve. A fine mist rose from the grass, glittering under the porch light. When she crouched beside the casing, she noticed something she hadn't before, a thin plastic seal looped through the handle, marked with a printed serial number and a small sticker bearing the HOA logo. It hadn't been there the previous night. She cut the seal with her pruning shears and lifted the lid. Inside, everything looked normal, except for a small tag tied to the valve stem, stamped with today's date. The neat handwriting read, "Inspection completed, pending compliance." Savannah stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the casual invasion implied by that single note. Someone from the association had stepped onto her property without notice, touched her equipment, labeled it as theirs, and walked away. The thought filled her with a cold, rising anger that settled behind her ribs like a stone. By midnight, she had written another letter, this one less measured, her words sharp and deliberate. She demanded to know who had authorized the inspection and how her private land could be subject to an organization she never joined. When she sealed the envelope, her reflection in the dark kitchen window startled her. She looked older somehow, tighter around the eyes, wary. Outside, the wind pressed through the trees, carrying the faint groan of the old pipes below. Savannah realized then that the fight had already begun, and she hadn't even chosen to enter it. The morning after mailing her complaint, Savannah awoke to the sound of voices outside. At first she thought it was another delivery truck idling on the road below, but when she stepped out onto her porch, she saw two men in navy uniforms standing by her well. They wore reflective vests with the HOA's insignia stitched on the back and carried clipboards, speaking to each other in the kind of casual tone people use when they assume no one is listening. The older of the two was pointing at the pump housing with a pen, while the other crouched near the base, taking photos. Savannah descended the porch steps quickly, calling out to them before she even reached the garden. "You're on private property," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. The older man straightened, but didn't look surprised. He simply raised his badge in a perfunctory motion, like a traffic officer bored with routine. "Routine inspection," he said. "We're documenting current infrastructure before connection to the community system." Savannah stopped a few feet away, her pulse hammering. "You can't just walk in here and start taking pictures," she said. "I've already filed a protest." The man gave a mild shrug. "That doesn't suspend fieldwork, ma'am. The association has authorization under community safety provisions." His tone was so flat that for a moment she questioned her own reality. The second man glanced at her, then down at his tablet, typing something. "You'll get a copy of the report," he said quietly, without lifting his eyes. Savannah stood there until they left, their truck rumbling down the hill, leaving tire marks across the soft soil. When she walked back to the pump, she found a plastic tag hanging from the handle again, identical to the first one but with a new serial number. It read, "Inspection complete. Do not tamper." This time there was also a small plastic container resting beside the housing, sealed with a label that said, "Water sample, HOA Testing Division." She frowned, kneeling beside it. The container was light, almost suspiciously so. She shook it gently and realized it was empty. There was no sample inside. Savannah brought it indoors, washed the dirt from its surface, and studied it under the kitchen light. The label was freshly printed, but the barcode at the bottom had been scratched over with a thin blade, as if deliberately rendered unreadable. It made no sense. She checked her email, expecting perhaps an automated message from the HOA confirming a test, but there was nothing. The whole thing felt staged, like a prop left behind to justify an entry that should never have happened. That evening she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her house sat slightly above the neighborhood, its windows offering a full view of the street below. Normally she found the lights comforting, but now every porch lamp and parked car seemed like an eye turned upward toward her. 2 days later, another envelope appeared, smaller this time, stamped "Notice of Contamination." The letter claimed that initial testing of her water had shown bacterial inconsistencies, recommending immediate suspension of usage until remediation. She stared at it in disbelief. There was no mention of what kind of bacteria, no test results, no lab signature. Just a warning and a reminder that non-compliance could incur penalties. The phrasing was maddeningly circular. The HOA was accusing her of contamination based on a test they hadn't actually conducted. It was the sort of bureaucratic trap that thrived on apathy. Most people would just obey to avoid trouble. But Savannah wasn't built that way. That night, armed with a flashlight and her old toolkit, she decided to open the pump housing completely and inspect every connection. The screws were stiffer than she remembered, and when she finally lifted the heavy lid, the metallic smell of wet soil hit her. She crouched, tracing the main line from the pump to the house, then to the pressure tank. Everything looked fine until her light caught a faint glimmer in the dirt. A narrow metal fitting branching from the main pipe, running diagonally away from the house. She brushed the soil aside with her gloves and found a small secondary line, no thicker than her thumb, disappearing into the earth toward the direction of the HOA's pumping station downhill. Her first thought was disbelief. The second was anger so sudden it almost made her dizzy. Someone had physically tapped into her water system. The pipe was new, too new. The fittings were stainless steel, the sealant clean and uncorroded. She followed it for several feet before the ground grew too compact to dig further. The connection was precise, almost professional. It hadn't been done by amateurs. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. For a moment, she simply stared at the dark line of soil, thinking of every time the pump had run late at night, every unexplained drop in pressure, every notice that had arrived under the guise of community safety. The realization settled in her chest like a stone. They weren't trying to ban her well. They were trying to control it. The next morning, she drove into town and found a small hardware supplier who still sold analog water meters, the kind with brass fittings and mechanical dials. The clerk, an older man with hands stained by years of grease, didn't ask questions when she explained she needed to measure a private supply line. By sunset, she had installed it herself, splicing the device between the main valve and the branch pipe. When she checked it the following day, the dial had spun wildly, registering nearly 12,000 gallons in a 24-hour period, an impossible figure for a single household. Savannah felt her throat tighten as she wrote down the number in her notebook. The theft wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was measurable, documented, undeniable. She sent copies of the readings to the county utilities office. Not because she trusted them, but because she wanted a timestamp, proof that she had tried to report it before it could be twisted into something else. Days passed without response, but one afternoon she noticed a man in a silver sedan parked near the edge of her property. He wasn't from the HOA, no logo, no clipboard, but he lingered for nearly an hour, pretending to check his phone. When she finally walked toward him with her camera, the car started immediately and drove away. That night, another notice appeared taped to her gate. Unauthorized tampering with inspection devices is a violation of community code. It was unsigned. Savannah read it in the glow of her porch light, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. The fight had moved from paperwork to intimidation, and she understood now that they would not stop until she either surrendered her well or broke the rules badly enough for them to justify seizing control. She folded the letter neatly, placed it on the kitchen table beside her growing stack of evidence, and whispered to herself the one truth that now defined everything. If they were stealing her water, they were capable of anything. Savannah had never believed in coincidences, but what was happening now felt less like chance and more like a carefully orchestrated tightening of a net she hadn't realized she was caught in. A week had passed since she discovered the illegal branch line and reported it to the county, and in that time the silence had grown heavier, deliberate, as if every office that might have helped her had quietly decided to look away. The only acknowledgement she received came in the form of a polite automated email thanking her for her environmental concern and informing her that her report had been forwarded to the appropriate department. No names, no signatures, just a template message that sounded as empty as the water container the inspectors had left behind. The meter she installed continued to tick like a pulse, consuming thousands of gallons each day. Her notebook had become a log of theft, columns of numbers that rose faster than she could process. Each morning she recorded the reading, each night she double-checked it, and each time she felt the same hollow dread growing beneath her ribs. Someone was taking her water deliberately, methodically, and with access that should have been impossible. Her anger finally pushed her to act beyond letters and polite complaints. She drove down the hill toward the HOA office again, this time without warning or appointment. The same young receptionist looked up when she entered, her smile faltering for the first time. Savannah placed the binder of data on the counter with enough force to make the pen holder rattle. "Someone has tapped into my system," she said quietly but firmly. "You're stealing my water. I have readings, evidence, photos. You'll want to see them before I go to the State Department." The receptionist's eyes darted to a door at the back, the one labeled Authorized Personnel Only, and within seconds, a man in a crisp gray suit emerged. He introduced himself as Mark Ellis, Operations Director for the HOA. His voice was polite, but it had the careful neutrality of someone trained to speak without revealing emotion. "Ms. Moore," he said, "why don't we step into my office? I'm sure this can be cleared up." The office smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old carpet. Certificates hung in neat alignment along one wall, each bearing some generic accreditation in community management. Savannah explained everything from the unauthorized inspections to the hidden pipe, laying out her photographs and notes like evidence in a trial. Mark listened with a faint frown, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When she finished, he leaned back, folding his hands. "I can assure you, the association has no interest in your private system," he said. "If there's been a misconnection, it may stem from legacy infrastructure predating our oversight. The subdivision has complex water routing. Many of those lines were installed decades ago." His words were practiced, evasive. "Then you'll have no objection to me sealing the line that connects to my property," she said. His eyes flickered for the briefest moment before he smiled again. "That wouldn't be advisable. If that line supplies neighboring systems, interference could result in fines or civil liability. You'd be tampering with community property." Savannah stared at him, her pulse hammering. "Community property?" she repeated. "You're saying my private well is part of your system?" Mark's tone didn't change. "I'm saying that infrastructure doesn't recognize property lines as clearly as paperwork does. It's complicated." That night she couldn't sleep. The phrase echoed in her mind. Infrastructure doesn't recognize property lines. It sounded absurd, yet chillingly bureaucratic, the kind of logic that allowed theft to masquerade as regulation. Near midnight, she took her flashlight again and went outside. The air was cold enough to bite at her skin. She followed the direction of the unauthorized pipe downhill, tracing its shallow path beneath the soil until she reached the boundary, marked by an old stone wall. On the other side, lay a maintenance corridor owned by the HOA, a narrow strip of gravel leading to a small pump shed. The door was secured with a heavy lock, but through the thin metal siding she could hear a faint, rhythmic hum, the unmistakable vibration of water flow. She pressed her ear against the surface and felt the steady pulse through the wall. Her water was running beneath her feet, diverted and distributed without her consent. Savannah stood there for a long moment, then turned and walked back up the hill. By morning, she was at the county archives, requesting copies of every recorded easement and water right connected to her property. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched halfway down her nose, looked confused when Savannah handed over the parcel number. "You're sure this is the right address?" she asked after a few minutes of typing. "It's not listed under active registration." Savannah frowned. "What do you mean, not listed? I pay property taxes every year." The clerk shrugged. "I'm not talking about the land, it's the water record. The well's registration was moved under Lakewood Heights Management Authority in 2017. That's the HOA's corporate name." For a second, Savannah thought she had misheard. "Moved? By whom?" "It doesn't say. It just lists an internal transfer and a note. Source integrated for supply redundancy." The paper the clerk handed her was thin and slick with age, yet the ink marking the transfer date was a darker shade than the rest of the document. The signature at the bottom looked faintly blurred, printed rather than written. A stylized approval stamp had been scanned into the corner, but something about it caught her attention. The misalignment of the lettering, the same typographical quirk she'd once encountered years ago when a local print shop had botched her company's letterhead. The O in authority was slightly slanted, a flaw unique to a discontinued font. That stamp couldn't have been made in 2017 or 1991, as the attached note claimed. It had been fabricated recently, using a digital copy of an old form. Savannah felt a slow, rising horror. Someone had falsified the paperwork to make it appear as if her well had been voluntarily integrated into the HOA system years earlier. She spent the rest of the day cross-referencing the names listed in the document. Most of the board members who had supposedly authorized the transfer no longer lived in the area. One had died 5 years prior. Another had moved to Arizona. It was a ghost record, an entire transaction built on signatures that no living person could verify. When she brought this information to the county water department, the clerk there listened politely, then leaned closer with a sigh. "Ms. Moore, I shouldn't say this, but you're dealing with a mess that no one wants to touch. The HOA supplies water to over 400 homes and several public facilities. If it turns out their supply isn't legitimate, that becomes a state-level issue. They'll bury this before they admit fault." Her tone softened. "You didn't hear it from me. But if you want anyone to take this seriously, contact the Department of Natural Resources. They have oversight beyond county lines." That night, Savannah drafted a formal report to the DNR, attaching every document, every photograph, every data log. When she pressed send, she felt both relief and dread. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. 2 days later, a white SUV pulled into her driveway. The man who stepped out wasn't from the HOA. He wore a plain khaki jacket with a DNR badge clipped to the pocket. His name was Aaron Vega, Regional Water Inspector. He spoke little, his manner steady but cautious, and as he examined the unauthorized line in her meter logs, his expression darkened. "This isn't an oversight," he said finally. "This is diversion on a large scale. They've been routing water through your system for years." He took samples, photographed the fittings, and promised to initiate a formal inquiry. For the first time in weeks, Savannah felt something close to hope. But hope is fragile when it threatens profit. 3 days after Vega's visit, Savannah found a red tag nailed to her front gate. "Notice of safety closure. Well operation suspended by order of state investigation." At first, she thought it was retaliation from the HOA, but the seal bore the DNR's insignia. Confused, she called Vega's office, but the receptionist told her he was unavailable due to reassignment. No one could tell her where he'd gone or who had authorized the closure. The pump had been shut down remotely through a switch she didn't even know existed. The flow cut off completely. That night, when she turned on her tap, the pipes coughed and groaned before falling silent. The water that had sustained her for years was gone, trapped beneath ground and bureaucracy alike. Standing by the dry sink, Savannah realized that her discovery had shifted the balance. The HOA no longer wanted to claim her water quietly. They wanted her silenced entirely, and they now had the state's seal to back them. Yet she also knew something they didn't. Every reading, every document, every forged signature had been copied and hidden in a safe place far from her home. They could take her water, but not the truth. The war had only paused. The ground beneath her house still hummed faintly, as if the mountain itself was waiting for her next move. Savannah had always believed that institutions, however flawed, were bound by at least a trace of fairness. But in the weeks following the state's so-called investigation, that belief eroded the way her land had begun to erode. Slowly, silently, without anyone admitting it was happening. The red tag remained nailed to her gate, and even though no one had come to enforce the closure physically, the symbol of it felt like a brand. Neighbors who once waved from their driveways now turned away when she passed. Someone on the community forum began spreading the claim that she had poisoned her groundwater with illegal chemicals, and within days the rumor evolved into certainty. Children who used to buy herbs from her garden stand avoided her fence, their parents whispering excuses about health concerns. What struck her wasn't the cruelty of it, but the coordination, the way hostility appeared overnight, as though someone had distributed a script. She stopped receiving mail directly. Instead, envelopes began arriving torn or resealed, some with faint water stains that suggested deliberate tampering. One afternoon, she found a packet of photocopied flyers on her porch. Each one bore the HOA logo and a headline in bold red. Public Health Advisory, do not consume water sourced from private wells. Her address was circled in pen. She could almost hear the smug laughter of whoever had printed them, imagining themselves as guardians of community safety. The absurdity might have been laughable if it didn't isolate her so thoroughly. Local stores began refusing her service for plumbing supplies. When she tried to buy new filters at the hardware shop, the cashier quietly told her that a hold had been placed on her account pending verification of water safety. That was when she understood that this wasn't defamation born of gossip. It was a coordinated effort to suffocate her independence. The one thing they hadn't anticipated was her persistence. Unable to use the well directly, she returned to the analog meter she had installed and modified it to function as a mechanical logger, running on stored pressure readings rather than flow. It recorded every surge, every pulse of water that passed beneath her land. Even with the official shutdown in place, the dial continued to move. Someone was still drawing from the lines under her property, using her well as a silent artery to keep the rest of the subdivision running. It was a theft masked as necessity. She began keeping her lights off at night, watching through the window as unmarked maintenance trucks came and went down the access road. Their engines idled in the dark for hours before disappearing toward the HOA's pumping station. She recorded the dates, times, and vehicle numbers. Patterns emerged: 3 visits a week, always between midnight and 4 a.m. When she finally confronted the HOA again, they refused to meet her in person. The receptionist said all communication now had to go through legal channels due to ongoing litigation risk. Savannah hadn't filed a single lawsuit, but the phrase made it sound as if she were the aggressor. Soon after, she received a certified letter accusing her of interference with community utilities, and demanding compensation for damages incurred from uncooperative conduct. The attached invoice totaled more than $20,000. The charge list included items like emergency water rerouting, pump recalibration, and temporary resource deficit. Each term was so deliberately opaque that even her attempts to interpret it made her laugh out loud, though the sound came out closer to a sob. It was extortion camouflaged in procedural language. For a few days, she considered leaving, selling the house, walking away from the madness. But the idea of surrendering her father's land made her physically ill. Instead, she began searching for allies, quietly and without optimism. She reached out to an environmental advocacy group she'd once donated to, explaining her situation in clinical terms, avoiding the emotional details. To her surprise, one of their researchers called her back the next morning. His name was Jonathan Keene, a hydrogeologist with a voice that carried equal parts fatigue and curiosity. He told her he had seen similar cases. Small landowners whose wells were absorbed into municipal systems through forged easements or fabricated contamination claims. "It's not common," he said, "but it's growing. Once water becomes infrastructure, ownership dissolves. You're no longer a person. They treat you like a component." His words frightened her more than the threats. Keene agreed to meet her at her property under the pretense of conducting a geological survey. He arrived in a plain truck, bringing a set of acoustic sensors and a portable analyzer. Together, they traced the underground resonance of the diverted line. The readings were unmistakable. Water was being pumped continuously from her aquifer toward the HOA supply network. Keene crouched near the meter, frowning as the device hummed softly. "They've embedded remote triggers," he said. "Look here, tiny magnetic seals that can open or close the valve from another control point. That's why your shutoff didn't stop the flow. They're using your system as a pressure buffer." Savannah stared at the mechanism, feeling both vindicated and nauseated. "Can you prove it?" she asked. Keene hesitated. "In theory, yes. But if I file this officially, the data gets routed through the same state office that approved the previous inspection. You'd disappear into paperwork again." He paused, lowering his voice. "There's another option. The DNR keeps backups of environmental incident logs. If we can get access, you might find who authorized the original diversion." The plan sounded half mad, but it was the first hint of strategy that didn't end in silence. Over the next week, Savannah followed Keene's instructions, submitting a records request under the pretext of historical research. She asked for every water use report for Lakewood Heights over the last decade. The response, when it came, was almost laughable in its clumsiness. The files were heavily redacted, with entire sections blacked out, but one column in the digital ledger had been overlooked. It listed Primary Source ID, JAJ LM 1027, a code she recognized from her own well registration papers. There it was in black and white, her property officially listed as the main feed for the HOA's water supply. It was no longer a suspicion or a technical mistake, it was recorded fact. Armed with this evidence, she sent a final demand letter to the HOA and the county attorney, citing water rights violations and fraud. She expected either silence or threats, but what arrived instead was a hand-delivered notice from a private law firm representing the association. The letter accused her of defamation of character and disruption of essential services, threatening a lawsuit if she continued to spread misinformation. The signature at the bottom was Mark Ellis. His neat handwriting had replaced the mechanical type, as if to remind her that this fight was no longer abstract. It was personal. That night, a new kind of fear settled over her property, not the fear of violence, but of erasure. The next morning, the analog meter she had installed was gone. The hole where it had been was filled and tamped down neatly, the soil undisturbed except for the faint outline of a shoe print. Whoever had done it knew exactly what they were taking and wanted her to know how easily they could take more. Savannah stood over the empty spot, the wind cold against her neck, and understood with brutal clarity that she was running out of ordinary options. The institutions were compromised, the neighbors cowed, and the thieves emboldened by her isolation. Yet the land beneath her still held its secret, the buried truth of every forged document and hidden pipe, and she knew she would rather destroy the well herself than let them claim it completely. For the first time since the conflict began, anger felt cleaner than fear, a steady current flowing beneath her calm. The next time they came for her water, she decided, they would find nothing left to steal. The storm broke on a Thursday morning, heavy rain blurring the edges of the landscape until even the line of the hill seemed to dissolve into mist. Savannah had been awake since before dawn, her mind running in circles around the fragments of evidence she still possessed. The missing meter, the erased records, the forged signatures. Each piece was a truth that meant nothing without recognition. But as the storm raged outside, she realized that recognition no longer mattered. What mattered was exposure, and that meant forcing the truth into a place where it could not be quietly buried. She retrieved the folder she had hidden inside an old cedar chest, its edges worn soft from constant handling, and spread the contents across her kitchen table. Water-stained pages, photographs of the unauthorized pipe, the redacted state records, and the registry code that tied her well to the HOA supply system. All of it formed a map of theft that stretched from her backyard into the heart of the county's bureaucracy. By mid-morning, she made her decision. The only remaining way to break through the silence was to deliver everything directly to the state office, not through email or mail, but in person, where someone would have to look her in the eye before turning her away. She loaded the folder into her truck and drove through the rain toward the government complex downtown, her tires slicing through flooded streets. When she arrived, the building loomed like a washed-out monolith, the flag outside snapping against the wind. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over empty corridors, and the smell of wet paper hung in the air. The clerk at the reception desk blinked at her name and frowned, typing something into a database. "Ms. Moore," she said finally, her tone shifting. "You're here about the Lakewood Heights inquiry?" Savannah nodded. "Then you'll need to speak with Division Head Peterson. He's expecting you." The phrase startled her. Expecting her. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. Peterson's office was on the third floor, windowless, its walls lined with filing cabinets. The man himself was thin, balding, with the kind of expression that managed to convey both impatience and mild curiosity. He gestured for her to sit. "I understand you've made several reports," he said. "Quite persistent ones." Savannah placed the folder on his desk. "Persistent because no one's listening," she said. "Your department shut down my well under the pretense of contamination while the HOA continued stealing water from it. I can prove it." Peterson opened the folder slowly, glancing at a few pages before setting it aside. "These are serious allegations," he said evenly. "But the matter's already been reviewed. The Lakewood Heights supply system is classified as a community infrastructure project. The well in question has been officially integrated since 2017. Savannah leaned forward, her voice rising. "That integration was forged. The signatures are fake. The stamp is digital, and the data logs link my property directly to their system." Peterson sighed, steepling his fingers. "You're not the first homeowner to misunderstand how regional resource management operates," he said. "These systems evolve. Boundaries blur. Your well isn't being stolen. It's serving a greater need." The calmness in his tone chilled her more than any threat could have. "You knew," she whispered. "You all knew." He didn't respond, And in that silence she understood that her fight had never been against a rogue HOA, but against an entire apparatus that had decided her property was expendable. She stood abruptly, gathering the papers, but Peterson raised a hand. "There's no need for dramatics. I can have someone escort you out." His words were final, dismissive, and something inside her snapped, not with rage, but with clarity. She walked out into the storm without looking back. The folder pressed against her chest, its edges softening in the rain. For a long moment she sat in her truck, breathing hard, then turned the ignition and drove, not home, but toward the edge of Lakewood Heights, where the old maintenance corridor ran beneath the hillside. The rain made the gravel slick, the air thick with the smell of wet clay and metal. When she reached the pump shed, she saw that the door was ajar. Light spilled through the crack, and inside she heard the mechanical roar of the pump straining against the flood. Someone was there, adjusting the controls. As she stepped closer, she recognized him even before he turned. Mark Ellis, in a soaked trench coat, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," he said, raising his voice over the machinery. "This is restricted." Savannah moved past him toward the main control panel, where gauges trembled in the red. "You're diverting from my line even now," she shouted. "The well's still running." Mark's composure wavered for the first time. "The system can't stop," he said. "If we shut it down suddenly, the entire network collapses. You have no idea what you're interfering with." She stared at the panel, at the blinking warning lights and the flow meter that bore her well's serial number. It was the proof she had been chasing for months, but it was also the heart of the machine that had consumed her life. The roar of the pumps grew louder, the storm outside hammering against the roof. "Then let it collapse," she said quietly, and reached for the master valve. Mark lunged forward, but she was faster. The handle turned with a violent hiss, and the sound that followed was like the breath of the earth itself exhaling. Pressure built in the pipes, the gauges spiking before shattering in a spray of steam. Water surged through the system, uncontrolled, bursting from the relief vents outside in a geyser that mixed with the rain. Mark stumbled back, shouting something she couldn't hear, while Savannah stood motionless, watching the machinery tremble and fail. It wasn't triumph she felt, but release, a terrible, cleansing certainty that the lie was finally breaking apart. When the system finally died, the silence was immense. The shed lights flickered, and in their dim glow she saw the water spreading across the floor, muddy and cold. Somewhere down the hill, alarms began to wail. Savannah turned and stepped into the storm, the folder clutched tightly against her chest, the rain washing the last traces of soil from her hands. Behind her, the pumps of Lakewood Heights drowned in their own stolen water, and for the first time in months, she felt the ground beneath her steady again. The next morning, the air over Lakewood Heights smelled of rust and rain. The storm had cleared, but left the streets hollow and glistening, the manicured lawns turned to patches of brown mud. Savannah stood at the edge of her property, watching trucks and repair crews swarm the lower valley, where the HOA's pump system had once hummed with mechanical precision. The collapse had been total. Lines burst open along the main corridor, flooding the storage basins and contaminating the holding tanks with silt. The neighborhood had lost its entire water supply overnight, and what had begun as quiet whispers of frustration was now an open uproar. Residents demanded answers, but no one from the board had stepped forward. Mark Ellis was missing, his office sealed by state order. The same authorities who had dismissed her now combed through the wreckage, their pristine white vehicles lined along the soaked road like monuments to hypocrisy. Savannah hadn't slept. She sat through the night with the radio murmuring in the background, listening to the cautious tone of local reports describing the incident as a system malfunction. None of them mentioned her name, but every word carried its shadow. She wasn't naive enough to think they would ever credit her for exposing the theft. Yet the silence was satisfying in its own way. It meant they were afraid to explain what had really happened. By noon, a man from the Department of Natural Resources arrived at her gate. Someone she didn't know. Younger, nervous, trying to appear calm as he informed her that the state was taking control of all remaining infrastructure in Lakewood Heights. His tone softened when he added that the well on her property had been officially reclassified as private and protected. "No one can touch it now," he said. She thanked him, though the words felt unnecessary. She had already decided that no one ever would. For days afterward, she walked the perimeter of her land, tracing the faint scars in the earth where the stolen pipeline had once run. The grass there was beginning to regrow, fragile and pale. In the evenings, she would sit by the well, listening to the steady trickle echoing up from below, the sound deeper and slower than before, as if the mountain itself were breathing again. Sometimes she wondered what had become of the people who had built their comfort on her silence, the board members, the inspectors, the faceless clerks whose signatures had rewritten her rights. She knew some would be replaced, others quietly reassigned, the machinery of bureaucracy grinding forward as if nothing had happened. But she also knew that their system, however vast, had a fracture now, one that would not heal. When the new inspectors came to test her water a month later, they found it as clean as ever. They offered her papers to sign confirming the results, but she only smiled and told them to leave them on the porch. As their car disappeared down the road, she turned back toward the well, its lid gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. The land was quiet again, the air thick with the smell of cedar and earth. For the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel like isolation. It felt like ownership. Savannah Moore no longer trusted the institutions that had tried to erase her, but she trusted the ground beneath her feet. It had survived theft, deceit, and bureaucracy, and so had she. In that stillness, she realized the truth her father had always hinted at. Water doesn't belong to those who claim it on a paper. It belongs to those who listen to it, protect it, and refuse to let it be stolen.